Catherine was at UIC from 1988 to 1993, and I think we first met at an after-hours reading group on contemporary theory she was leading for interested faculty and students. I was neither at the time. I don't mean interested, I mean faculty or student. I was interested, but I just wasn't one of those categories. And when she began her tenure here in 1988, Catherine co-edited the fourth issue of the school's journal Threshold, which was entitled Restructuring Architectural Theory. In the same year, she participated in a conference at the Chicago Institute for Architecture and Urbanism, which no longer exists, where she was also a fellow at the time, which really launched and solidified her generation of architectural theorists and critics, which, in addition to herself, included people like Jeff Kipnis, Ann Bergen, Jennifer Bloomer, Mark Wigley, Beatrice Colomina, Mark Wigley, among others. Catherine's first book, Architecture and the Burden of Linearity, is a product of much of her thinking done here at the time. After the diaspora that followed our shared patron, Stanley Tigerman's dismissal as director, Catherine joined the school as a member of the faculty at Iowa State University before moving on to Pratt in 1999. From 91 to 99, Catherine was an editor of the extremely central, influential architectural journal Assemblage, where she was instrumental in getting her UIC design colleagues published, including, among others, Doug Garofalo's Camouflage House, and also early work by Greg Lynn. In 2006, Catherine published her second book, Architecture, Animal, Human, and is now completing her third, Architecture, Property, and the Pursuit of Happiness. I would say that, like others of us at the time, Catherine was one of those who began outside architecture proper and worked her way in, having graduated with a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Clearly it was a sketchy thing to do at the time, with a dissertation on Thomas Pynchon. Although the title of her dissertation, which is actually hard to find, by the way, just to show I've done a little archival research here, shows her alliance with architecture already. It was called Complexion and Complexity, I believe, do I correct that? Thomas Pynchon's reading of the American scene. But actually the intersection of Catherine's work on literature and theory with architecture was, you could say, preordained, as both of her parents were architects, and her mother, Elizabeth Wright Ingraham, was the daughter of John Lloyd Wright and the granddaughter of Frank Lloyd Wright. So it seemed that, in a certain sense, Catherine avoided 3 generations of the family business, only to return as one of its preeminent intellects and critics. And I think that in her own work, really embodying, you could say, the perpetual struggle between the book and the building, or maybe architecture as construction and architecture as writing, which I think you can see in the work on the line, which is to say her work, the line as constructed, as drawn, and as written, and the way in which that line is both static and animate. In terms of these discussions, I should say there is no secret smoking gun or previous connection among the discussants. It's really a kind of arranged marriage on our part, so they are all in for a surprise as much as we are. That said, there is some rationale to the pairing tonight, and that part of this series is also, I think, about lines, but really also maybe genealogical lines. Lines of influence with all of the burden that accompanies them. In other words, how architectural ideas migrate from one place in time to another. In the case specifically of Catherine's direct influence from UIC to Iowa to Pratt and elsewhere. In the case of our contemporary at the time, for example, Greg Lynn, from here to Columbia to UCLA and elsewhere. So it seemed to me that as graduates of UCLA under Greg and his progeny, that there would be some resonance in terms of the line, as well as animalism and animation, between Catherine's work and that of Kelly and Antonio's generation from UCLA, and that it was a kind of resonance worth discussing, whether or not it was ever conscious or not. And so I think maybe it's also inevitable that Kelly and Antonio in some way would end up back here, you could say, at the scene of the crime. When you're born into a school or a family, or both, because sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, you assume every school or family is the same, and it takes time to realize how singular and hopefully how lucky or fortuitous your time is in terms of your formation and your future. I was very lucky to be sort of born into this school, into teaching in proximity of Catherine and others at the time, and only realize now, in a way, how lucky that was, because it turns out not all schools and families are the same. And you realize how sort of precious and fragile they are. So I would like to thank all three here in advance, Catherine, Kelly, and Antonio, for being members of ours and for being willing to play. So I will turn it over to Antonio.
All right. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Bob. I mean, I don't know how I can top that introduction, but so let's just get into it. It's always great to also find out that you have other, families or relatives in architecture that, I would embrace that, Catherine, as a maybe architecture aunt or something like that. But anyways, I think that the format, we'll start with Catherine kind of talking to us about the then, 25 years ago, UIC architecture in Chicago during the 90s, which, is actually when I came to Chicago when I was 1992. I was about 11 years old, so very different context. But we'll hear about Catherine, and then Kelly will offer a response to maybe the lineage of Catherine's work to the now. So I believe you roll with no images. I think that's awesome. So go for it.
Thank you. This is like a minefield, of possible mistakes, but mistakes in memory and also mistakes in attributions and so forth. But I didn't really like the idea of being the then, but I thought, I don't want to be the then, I don't want to go down memory lane and tell you what happened then. But it's, so I had a more, I guess, a stranger approach to the problem of, or to the presentation, and broke it into a couple of different categories. But then I also, at the end, discovered that a lot of what I'm talking about in these other categories found their roots here at a certain point in time, and were launched here, literally. And so, I sort of immediately see the virtue of the school at that moment, Stanley Tigerman certainly, but also the way in which Stanley and others were willing to sort of allow things to develop over a period of time. And because it went very fast, and it was also very intense. So I will get there more or less toward the end as a kind of just way of summarizing just statistically or historically a little bit of some of the dates and stuff. Meanwhile, I'm going to talk a little bit different about what actually Bob inspired if Bob hadn't said this, I would have probably not agreed to be the then, but he said something really interesting, which was, he said, we're interested in schools and schools of thought, and just as he was saying in his introduction, and we're interested in arcs and trajectories of work, and I thought, well, that's very interesting, it's true. And so they happen in time and through time, and they have histories and things you can trace, but most of it you can't really trace in any, it's not a straight line, obviously, but, and it's like boring to trace it if it's like recounting your dreams or something, it's like why do we want to hear about all this? But it's the intensity of the experience for the person is very different than the account of it after it's happened. So I made a little list of topics, and the first one for me was writing, and mentioned in the introduction as well, appropriately. And I wanted to use that as a way of organizing a little bit the idea of the arc and the trajectory of a body of work. I wrote, when I was at UIC, to retrace the path in a way, which is really the making of a path. I was working on a book on linearity and lines through a very kind of informed by all the work I'd done as a doctoral student, and it had it had the momentum that piece of work gave me actually didn't manifest itself until somewhat later. There was a piece of that book that was talking about the question of the proper, which is the proper name and the sort of proper, the status of the proper, and also questions of propriety in architecture. How I got from, the arc is that I started there, and now I'm writing a book on property. So the property work came out of, really gestated over a very long period of time from that initial interest in propriety. Propriety is not interesting in a certain sense. It's like one of the most tedious things of the human race, is like the way in which we try to get everything right and often end up with rules and regulations that are completely restrictive and repressive and essentialist and so forth. So it was so in itself, that the transformation requires lots of qualification in order to see how interesting property is, how interesting propriety is, and how in the end they sort of belong to each other, as do all the other terms that might be associated of the appropriate and the appropriation and so forth. So going from propriety to property became like what I wanted to kind of think about a little bit. It's old writing to new. And the new writing actually, it came from a different place. It wasn't like, again, it wasn't like I was thinking about priority all those years and it was on my list to do. It was somehow manifested itself in a form that I hadn't quite anticipated, although in retrospect it seems really obvious, that I sort of ran into massive control of the subject matter of property by a whole other dominion of theoretical, regulatory kind of concepts, mostly sociological nomenclatures that define relation of architecture to space vis-a-vis people and beings in a increasingly statistical way, and increasingly distant from the way in which I wanted to approach the problem of property. That I didn't want to fall into a sort of urban planning discussion, although fascinating as that would be in property terms. The question of data and statistics, which is with us today in a really fascinating and incredibly powerful way, that was in question for me, not the basis of my argument. I wasn't going back to the archive and sort of turning up case studies of property ownership per se. So it was a different form of evidence that I was kind of looking for there. But enfolded in this property work is the proprietarian history of property. And proprietarian histories of property are quite common. It turns out that property is about propriety in many, many cases. And we've forgotten that because we've lost, to some degree in the notion of property, we've lost the relationship of land to property, and we've substituted commodification, basically, and so that we have commodities that then are put into the marketplace. The land is put on the market in a highly alienable way, and therefore we're unable to track the proprietarian aspects of it in the same way that we might have in the 19th century or something. So that question of the propriety now enters that question of property after many years of different kinds of things happening. And it resulted in the pursuit of, in this current work, of pursuit of an understanding of like how property came to be and what property law is. And I was just reading recently Siegert's book on cultural techniques, where he talks about law. He doesn't talk in terms of property law, but he talks about law in architecture. And he signals out the door, which he says organizes space into outside, inside. And I mean, there are things about his discussion that I recognize as being totally familiar, and other things about it that somehow he's carving a new ground for the familiar. And he organizes, he talks about this door as, in a certain sense, in the domain of the nomos of the law, because it makes lawful certain sorts of relationships between outside and inside, and it governs that passage over the threshold. And so but simultaneously, and this is kind of the incorporation of the latter part of the 20th century, you could say, he says it creates this disequilibrium in energy and knowledge, which produces a circulatory system. And I came to this Siegert discussion quite long after I had more or less finished the manuscript for a property book. And in a certain sense, it made far more sense to me that if it is a thermodynamic system of some sort, certainly exchange of air and heat and cold, and as well as producing a gradient where you produce energy, and knowledge, it also then it's plausible that there's also a circulatory relationship with law, and property law in particular, which is governing the ground upon which we're building. So it began to fit together in that particular way. So proprieties became a crucial part of the discussion of property for me. Again, not propriety as a sort of more abstract understanding of the proper name or the properness of that makes us, properness of certain kinds of space or whatever, or styles. But proprieties as these things that Siegert calls these codes and spaces that shift against each other, importantly different at different times, not necessarily in sync, and the codes are the laws and the social practices that emanate from certain kinds of spatial organization. So it was a direct link, in a certain sense, that was between the propriety moment of my work and then this property moment, but it was interfered with by this other book that I did on animals. And it turned out the animals also came from the propriety place to some degree, through the donkey urbanism that I talked about, Le Corbusier's donkey urbanism and the donkey's path, and how our job is to make it straight. And the importance of the donkey urbanism is also actually, in interesting ways, discussed by Siegert as linearity being a line is a series of folds of the nonlinear, folding the nonlinear into a linear layout. And so the donkey informs us about the folds that we have to take into account, and there are many of them. And so, in a certain sense, the animal is never absent from some of my discussions, and there's a kind of, it emerges in the property book in various forms as well. So that was my first trajectory arc writing sort of comment. The second thing is what I call sort of writing in schools. And to say that, having now given you this arc of the propriety to property, I want to say there's no possibility of having a trajectory or a project that you project. And I use the word projection in full cognizant of the fact that the projective is actually Bob's specialty. So I would like to, I would like to engage actually with the post-critical at a certain moment, and I find out where that's at. But I'm just sort of saying what's obvious, and we all know that no sooner do you articulate a project, give it a plausible framework, like propriety goes to property or whatever, it's totally derailed in your second or third sentence, and you can either protect your first thoughts or your draft or your outline or whatever in order to be consistent and responsible and to have a book that is, marches forward, or you can get rid of them before they color the whole work and basically destroy it. So projects, which I would call loose thoughts, inflect and inform a school institutionally, and a school of thought, which is disciplinarity through their performances, and a school of thought is informed by its performance in received frameworks and formats like teaching, lecturing, publishing, building, exhibiting, and so forth. And of course, the shared illumination of this path in relation to other paths of other people. So these very large lateral determinants are something that schools routinely push away in the interest of defining themselves. They don't like the fact that the school bleeds beyond its perimeters, even though everybody in the school is every day going in and out and having all sorts of other global connections. And now we have our instruments of global connection. So but at the same time, the school has to somehow establish itself as have a physical integrity. But the truth is the work of the people in the school has no meaning on its own because it's in that school, although it might have it might belong to a school of thought which incorporates these big lateral determinants. But at the same time, it still has to achieve a kind of acceptance in the context of the school. So how does that happen? And one of the familiar frameworks we use is pedagogy, or teaching, and that in a way sort of gives us a first connection to the set of ideas that we're trying to develop and practice and assemble. And this was what UIC was for me at that moment. It was the first framework of architectural pedagogy where I was importing in a certain sense a lot of these big sort of lateral relationships that develop as you study something. And the next step is really to use that in some way, use your pedagogy to persuade students of the stake of the material and of its importance in relation to a field of some sort that's being drawn. This is extremely hard to do, really. It inspires a very different relationship, which is the pursuit, the personal pursuit in some way of something other than pedagogical context. And that's not to say that pedagogy is not a huge developmental laboratory for projects and for work, but to say that the teacher, someone at the stage of training who might be hired as a teacher, is always operating, whether activated in further activation or not, is always operating out of their training and its set of projects. And the training is coming through your schooling that you're now importing into another school. Training is what you need in order to be hired and given what I think of initially as fake authority and for enough time to develop a kind of reasonable authority. And it's also what you try to get rid of throughout your so-called career, in a way. The training is a deep groove, and the groove has substantial influence on you. Your words and phrases come from training, but your voice is this combination of these things. Designing, writing, speaking, you're designing or writing, that of course comes from you. So the laboratory is not just about the conveyance of knowledge or information to students, it's about the gestation of your relationship to these different forces. Mixed in with the institutionalized vessel, such as the ones I've been mentioning, you oscillate also in allegiance to what you think you know through your training and a desire to represent matters according to your own lights, an obligation to fulfill a set of questions that are both local and global. This was something of a convoluted story in my case, because I came to UIC after working for Bertrand Goldberg. Jeff Goldberg, his son, is here tonight. So Bertrand Goldberg hired me, God knows why. You know, the Frank Lloyd Wright connection notwithstanding, the parent architects notwithstanding, I knew nothing about architecture. And I worked in a kind of neo-architectural capacity for Bertrand, very generously, mainly trying to create a place for me and figure out what I was going to do. I had, and before that, before I did that, I had quit my teaching job at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I'd been for 2 years as a professor of comparative literature. And before that, I finished a PhD in Comp Lit at Johns Hopkins University. So I was in a number of years of quitting and leaving and taking up and quitting and leaving and taking up. And then I came to UIC. I think I quit the job at Bertrand Goldberg's office at a certain point too, and I didn't have a job. And I was in Chicago, I didn't have a job, and for a while I found freelance writing job or something to see me through, and then Stanley hired me. And because I had no training in architecture per se, you know, I used to work on the drafting board of my parents and stuff, I don't think that counts. I was doing my own crayon drawing or whatever, it was like irrelevant. And I knew the early tools of architecture, but not the contemporary tools of architecture, you know, the T-square and everything. But I was hired to teach. I was hired to teach architecture, and so I had to like go underground and retrain myself secretly in this field that it was assumed I knew just because it was like in the blood, you know. Thanks to Stanley, who I have said many times, thanks to Stanley Tigerman, above all, who doesn't like to be thanked and is ornery about being thanked, but he sort of allowed this kind of wild card into UIC at that moment, and he went on to bring in amazing people. And so it was super exciting, actually, to what happened. What happened in my case was two things, which is that I turned out not to have abandoned my discipline or my training, that I was confronting that discipline from a different perspective, mainly from the perspective of architecture, which I did not understand. So I was so the learning of architecture became a kind of filter, and the training became a kind of counter-filter in which these things began to talk to each other. Like, what would it mean to be thinking through some of the things I had been thinking through as a graduate student and a complete person, and not to mention the fact that Johns Hopkins at that moment was just embedded in post-structural philosophy in a really big way. Derrida was going there and during my training, and so all my training was this kind of hot topic at the moment, and so suddenly I had this sort of encounter of encountering architecture in the learning stage for me that was just unbelievably exciting. And I saw suddenly so many things that all had to be worked through, and there was a lot of loose language that came from that later had to be more carefully distributed and changed. The second thing I had was Frank Lloyd Wright, by the way, which was seemed to me a fairly hollow fact, in spite of the fact that it's like a magnificent fact, you know, and I mean, magnificently interesting. I, of course, had seen all Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings because we visited them, and I had been in them, and I knew all about the lore, you know, and I knew what I was supposed to be thinking about it. There was a lot of, at that time, during my childhood and later, you know, there were legends and things that Tallius and associates and family members would tell each other about Frank Lloyd Wright, and my father had studied under Frank Lloyd Wright, and my mother studied under Mies, here in Chicago, and when he was at the Armour Institute. And so we had this big architecture family and family discussions, and we would hear all the tales and things about Taliesin and Frank Lloyd Wright, but you know, I didn't learn anything about architecture at that point because I had no understanding of like what was going on. I just was looking at I was just listening to lore, and it was a big story. And I'm actually super happy that the archive is now at the Avery in MoMA because it's fallen into the hands of people who have no family and no Taliesin legends, and it's great. They're not calling Frank Lloyd Wright either grandfather or great-grandfather or Mr. Wright, worst of all. After Mr. Wright had its place maybe at a certain moment, but it now, if you go to Taliesin and you take the tour, I don't know if it's right now, it might have been then, but you have to like put on slippers and you tiptoe around and you whisper Mr. Wright, and everything, and it's like ridiculous. So I was really, so that's what that was my card, my big card was that, and so I would play that card when I needed it. And then what I mentioned earlier was that, and to elaborate a little bit on that, I had done my PhD, in a place and at a time when post-structural philosophy was at its kind of peak in the United States and was influential in all sorts of disciplines. And it was a very particular moment, and it was very serendipitous and completely lucky in every way for me that it dovetailed with what some architects were interested in at that moment. Peter Eisenman was interested, Stanley Tyerman was interested, and they in turn had their cadre of people and so forth that introduced me into a sort of a clubby way, but I didn't know at the time what the club was. I didn't understand the arguments at the time in architecture, so I was just happy that suddenly I could practice my training and do this secret learning. So I could use my training as a critic and philosopher to school myself in architecture. And Stanley codified and translated this on a regular basis to people that didn't know what the hell I was doing there. And so there was a kind of cultivation of my voice, a support of the cultivation of my voice here into basically what we called at the time this new field that we wanted to call essentially deconstruction or post-structuralism, but actually we ended up calling more architectural thinking or architectural theory. Just to give you one quote from Derrida about architecture, which is where the words architectural thinking come from. He said, architecture is not a technique separate from thinking and therefore possibly suitable to represent in space, but rather to raise the question of architecture as a possibility of thought. He's saying it's not architecture technique that then is able to represent things in space, but it raises the question, he raises the question that architecture is a possibility of thought, which cannot be reduced to the status of the representation of thought. The building isn't built in order to represent some other idea. It represents the very possibility of thinking in ideas. This is found, the words that support his argument and that everybody worked to death in a really, in some cases, fascinating, incredibly brilliant way were the clear nomenclature of regular architecture. It's like the foundation, it's the infrastructure, the frame, the house, the dwelling, the inside, outside, the entanglement of architecture with, all sorts of things that, as Secret said, with law, with socio-political forces, with thermodynamics, energy, all this stuff. And these cultural some of them cultural techniques like the door and all the elements that Rem Koolhaas talks about in architecture that are all of them somehow engaged with the existential status of thinking and the epistemic field created by thinking and are used all the time as ways of describing various bodies of thought, foundational thought, the essential idea, all this stuff. And this essentialism and representations given to us in all sorts of masses of different kinds of forms that surround us and that we are compelled to build. So it was, so this very possibility of thinking seemed like incredibly rich territory. The governing pedagogical question that I kept encountering and finding myself saying over and over again as I went into this business and trying to convey philosophical just language and sort of why is it important to, or what is it, it doesn't work, philosophical language in architecture in some way. It's clumsy and heavy, and when you try to do philosophical architecture, it's, almost disastrous because the weight of it is so crippling. And so, but I wanted to convey it to students and through my classes and so forth, and so I came up with this question, which is really obvious question to everybody in architecture in a certain sense. What does this have to do with architecture? What is this philosophical position? Possibility of thought and all the attendant things. What does it have to do with architecture? And so I would find myself at every turn of the road saying, well, what does this have to do with architecture? And that would force the question of architecture into the discussion I was having, and it would force something out of the philosophical position at the same time. And it was incredible. So it was incredible how the philosophy yielded to that question in a very particular way that began to represent this sort of plumbing of the meaning of the possibility of thinking as having seat or some other kind of relationship to architectural work at all levels of architectural work, not just sort of the best buildings, but all sorts, and not necessarily, and not buildings without architecture, which is always under contest what those are. But that's been under discussion for a long time. But so this. And this project was not just me doing this, it was suddenly, this was developing this kind of desire to explore these relationships. A lot of people were beginning to be involved in that. Thus, like Derrida, in a certain sense, who buys his way into architecture through using the word as this sort of metaphysical, in this metaphysical way, I sort of bought my way in, not by knowing philosophy per se, but by presenting and thinking of architecture as already something that structured thought. How it did that, the different arguments about when this is metaphoric, homological, or some other kind of structure that we don't recognize or identify as properly architectural, are in fact still underway. I see them in PhD dissertations now. I see them in people's work on all sorts of aspects of digital work. I see them still emerging over and over again in different forms of production. That's not to say we've had a continuous line. We haven't. The post-structural or deconstruction moment was quite short per se, and then we moved on into the problematic 10 years of digital learning, which silenced everybody for a long time. And there's a very important and I think significant rebellion against a lot of the process studio work that was done out of that philosophical attachment to architecture. So it was, and the whole format began to change. So it's not as if it's been continuous and I want it to keep emerging in exactly the same way it did initially. It's just really interesting to see how it's being taken up by archival practices, historical archival practices, as well as how it's entering this amazing discussion of experiential structures and other things we're facing now in the sort of the sensory world of the biological and of biomorphic world. So I found in my early years at UIC what I regard as a set of enormously interesting dilemmas in architecture. and that led me, for a very long time, or, as I said, in the work I'm doing even now. And I have never regretted my messy transition, even though I derailed my comp lit, career. It was just as if I somehow accidentally or luckily happened upon the perfect combination of things for my interests, which had to do with that architectural, in a sense, substrate of the family and the fascination of the field itself, and also then this incredible philosophical body of thought. So, I want to just start finishing up here by saying that I think that those of us who came from another field are often ingratiate ourselves with the discipline over time, and are grateful to be accepted into it in some way, knowing that we sometimes are held in suspicion and are regarded as idiosyncratic. But it seems to me that there's some evidence for why we need that and why we are, in fact, absolutely indebted to these other narratives that enter our field from all over the place all the time, that those are, in fact, what constitute that's our audience. That's who we're engaged with to some degree. That's who it's not people. It's sort of subject matters that we're always going out to and back into, the technological, the artistic, the philosophical, the poetic, sociological narratives are filtering through, and we often don't catch them. We don't catch them out. We just accept them at certain moments, and we just slavishly follow them. But other times we just, we transform them, and it's a huge transformative. It's that codes and spaces always oscillating against each other, pushing or against each other. So it's that's the end of the talk. But I thought it was interesting. Maybe I could give you like one last kind of framework summary, just the dates and numbers in a sense, a little bit of a statistical profile of this whole arc that I've been talking about. I came to UIC, it was like in 1987, I think, or maybe it was 88, but anyway, it lasted 6 years till 1993 when I went to Iowa. And during that period, before I came, the interregnum between, going on to some degree when I was working for Bertrand, and before I was hired by Stanley, I started writing for Inland Architect, which Cynthia Davidson Power was running. And I did about 10 essays between 1986 and 1981 for Inland Architect. And so Inland Architects was sort of getting in on the game to some degree, and eventually resulted in Cynthia marrying Peter Eisman, actually. I don't know whether that was, the social hookup. So it was, and then as I continued to write for Inland Architect, but then I was hired here, and between 1987 and 1993, I gave like 29 lectures, and I wrote an additional something. I wrote this down somewhere. An additional, I think, 18 articles that then were the basis for the first book I wrote. And so it was like explosive, this confrontation for me, of this philosophy with architecture, and the fact that it was being sponsored by UIC in some way, allowing me to sort of follow that path. Not just allowing, but, the places I was giving lectures were all over the world. at that moment. I was I was pretty young, and I was like, as I said, I was, ignorant of a whole part of my subject matter, and yet somehow the UIC allowed me to coalesce it, sort of I'm hoping in increasingly articulate ways over that time, but I was, kind of giving lectures everywhere. And it was just over that really 6-year period of time, I was producing a huge amount of material. And so it was clearly, it was partly, of course, the moment that a group was being formed around this subject matter. I was talking about this earlier with the people that do the Fresh Meat Journal, because how does publication figure into this, and how does a group form, and what does it mean to have a movement? And I don't have any answers to any of that question, but the formation of the group was problematic for people because a lot of people felt that it was this exclusive special language thing, very complicated, and you had to know how to unpack the sort of post-structural thing. And Assemblage was our journal, and which I was an editor of for about 8 years, and Michael Hayes and others were, and we had these kind of clubby things like working for the Charnley House, which was the Center for Architecture and Urbanism that was started by, and had John Whiteman at its head, and Liz Diller and Rick Scafidio were there, and Mark and Beatrice, and Ben Nicholson, and a number of other people were passing through there, and that was and I had a fellowship there, so there's concentration there, and then the Miami conference where we set up this thing. That was where I sort of gave a paper that then turned into my eventual book. And so there were just, I've always been interested in the beginning of cybernetics. It was a series of dinners and groups and meetings of cross-disciplinary and people getting together and talking, and it's kind of pompous to talk about, and there's no guarantee that a group goes anywhere, but when it cooks, and when somehow it connects with publication, and it connects with conferences, and it connects with sort of coalescence of schools and schools of thought and disciplines, it begins to feel like it actually is an exchange that has a certain significance for that point in time, that it hits a note at that time. And it was with the help of that dispersal of that philosophy through every single discipline practically in the country and in Europe. So it was spreading like crazy. It's a little bit like object-oriented ontology has been spreading to every discipline. Okay, so that's sort of the end, I think. I'm now interested in sort of a lot of new stuff around the post-digital too, but that might come up in another context. Okay.
Wow. Thank you, Catherine. Kelly, it's your turn to unpack all of that for us. As Kelly kind of prepared, and Kelly brought images, so that's good. But it's with all this work and stories, it's kind of hard for us not to try to go into the memory lane. When it sounds like that time in Chicago was quite productive with a lot of people here. But we'll hear Kelly kind of talk about the lineage to Catherine's work. So Kelly.
So there's a couple of ways I could have taken this talk. One would be to refer to Catherine's more recent 2006 book, Architecture, Animal, Human, The Asymmetrical Condition. I could have talked quite literally about animal architecture, buildings for, buildings that look like, or buildings that act, or in some cases perform like animals, either through their formal or material traits, all issues that were present in Central Standard Office from about 2014 to 2017. However, in the short time I have about 15 minutes, I thought it would be more fitting to go further back for Catherine into the then, sorry, Catherine, and more current for me into the now, and talk about two things specifically, linearity and lines, or to borrow from Catherine and maybe further back, Corb, donkey lines. So to quickly set this up, I'll refer to two of Catherine's texts. On the left is her essay, The Burdens of Linearity, Donkey Urbanism. This was the paper that she mentioned. I guess this was probably at the start of your 29, do you say 29 run lecture in those, those 6 years? So this was in 1998 at the Chicago Institute for Architecture and Urbanism, where at the time she was a fellow. A version of this paper, first published in Strategies in Architectural Thinking, will later be seen in the third chapter of Architecture and the Burdens of Linearity, a decade later on the right. In the essay and subsequently the book, Catherine recounts the story of Corbusier's pack donkey from the City of Tomorrow, where he claims that the donkey is responsible for the plan of every continental city, that the earliest tracks in the ground were a donkey's idea of how to move from one point to another, a strong contrast to the regulating line of humankind, orthogonal, geometric, and measured. To quote Catherine, which is a bit unsettling, with her sitting right here, the beast of burden, of course, must oppose orthogonality in order to give orthogonality a force, at least in this cartoon version of the pack donkey and the founding of urban culture. But the cartoon only makes sense if one can first imagine a proper path from which the donkey has deviated, and not just a proper path, but an economy and organization of labor, a human economy within which the beast is structured as a cultural rather than a natural or wild entity. The covert matter in which the beast of burden, the donkey, also stands as an oblique measure of human work, transgression, and human laziness, while retaining all the faults of the animal of nature, instinctive rather than rational motivations, indirection, enigmatic behavior, apparent mindlessness, and so on, complicates the orthogonal, non-orthogonal opposition immeasurably. So I'm going to show two projects that are heavily influenced, or you could say burdened by the line. Both projects work on the problem of the line as both a literal and conceptual pursuit. However, I will clarify that my conceptual take on the line is nascent compared to Catherine's more extensive writing, where she kind of expands the notion of the line into political, economic, and even human identity kind of issues or relationships to the line. Both of the projects that I'll show in some ways are sort of kind of small research projects that resulted in some exhibitions, but they both merge and expand on architectural issues that were present in our Venice Biennale project, which was a proposal that was invested in the thickening of profile, so essentially a closed polyline into volume. It's worth noting that at the completion of the two projects, we began to rethink those very terms, profile and volume, and we've since lumped them into a current body of research called loud lines, swapping volume for loud and profile for line. Loud lines, at least in the case of these two particular projects, are typically generated by a drawing methodology that uses virtual reality as a fully immersive canvas, where lines move from 2 to 3 dimensions. Lines now have surface, mass, and volume. In this drawing environment, line weight is a term that now bears physical and material qualities, and directionality moves beyond a Cartesian grid towards an in-the-round cloud of points. This choreography of the human body, the canvas, and the pictorial reference scrambles or possibly rearranges Robin Evans' arrested image diagram, suggesting that the distance between imagination, perception, and observer on the right and the designed object in the middle is lessened, and the perspective versus orthographic projection planes may in fact be collapsed into one. The first project that I'll show is called Graphic Line Object. It was commissioned for an exhibition called Designing the Computational Image, Imaging Computational Design. It was shown at Carnegie Mellon's Miller Gallery. The show was curated by Daniel Cardozo-Lash, and in the kind of prompt for the exhibition, he gave a statement that said, "An image is no longer understood as a pictorial representation of a design, but rather as an operative artifact performing it," prompting us to consider the project as a study in the performative act of drawing, a sort of in situ recording of an object in space, rehearsed differently each time. The project is comprised of a set of 3 what we call drawn models that explore the convergence of the virtual and the physical worlds of the drawn line, simultaneously gestural and measured, perhaps a domesticated form of the donkey line. To start, we identified 3 objects that are typically associated with a wall, the exhibition constraints taken at face value. These 3 things were a shelf, a plaque, and a tapestry. The shelf holds things, although it's somewhat indifferent to them. The plaque displays things, elevating the status of the object that it displays, in this case a line. And a tapestry uses a density of overlapping lines to produce a surface, embedding elements within its weave. Each model is produced from 3 distinct parts: a flat graphic, a thick line drawing, and an object. While these 3 things seem indifferent towards one another, their respective roles are important as they work as a tripartite set of elements with structural, representational, and material jobs to perform. The role of what is modeled, drawn, and displayed is sketched in VR and adapted for the physical realities of material fabrication and finishing, a further estrangement from the original network of lines as originally drawn. The VR environment offers a new way of using or misusing drawing conventions. Line weight, point of view, scale, and projection are all experienced in zero gravity in a sequence that allows us to immerse ourselves in the drawing in real time, cueing a range of precision, tolerance, and line qualities mid-stroke. Referring back to Evan's arrested image diagram, we find ourselves in a different relationship with the designed object. We now draw over, under, on, and in some cases within an object, sharing virtual and eventually physical space with it. The second project is a short film that was screened this fall for 1 month at the Night Gallery, which is a Chicago space in Bridgeport, not far from Sarah Dunn's office, that operates solely from dusk to dawn in the front window of this architecture firm. The unusual way in which in which the audience views the film, which is standing outside of the sidewalk looking in, offered us a way into the project that reimagined the conventional camera-audience relationship, as well as reconsider the typical linearity associated with film as a medium. In the Eames 1977 film Powers of 10, offered the idea of the slow zoom viewed through a camera with a 1 meter by 1 meter frame. The frame's aspect ratio is locked throughout the film while the contents within it scale, taking the audience through a range of scalar transitions and experiential worlds while preserving their distinct yet related spatial relationships. For us, the 42 square feet of projected image, the Night Gallery's window, suggests an imprecise point or plane in which a 2D facade gives way to a 3D interior, and then back again. This removes the temporal conventions of beginning, middle, and end in favor of a more cyclical sequence of inside, outside, and inside. There's an obvious nod to Hitchcock beyond the title. It's a film about looking through one's eyes, or camera, a mono point of view along a single line of vision. In this case, Jimmy Stewart's eyes that are always synced with the point of view of the camera as he looks across his courtyard. For us, an awareness of the film's audience, their point of view from outside of the window, paired with the careful framing of the subjects of the film, provided a spatial structure with which the narrative could unfold. Another rear window is staged in 4 types of virtual environments, all based on a single real environment, which is the future firm office itself that exists on the other side of the projection screen. I'll play the video. It's only 3 minutes. And then we can talk. All right. So the film opens with the drawing of a line. More lines are drawn. The lines are thick, and they have a dimension that exceeds 2 as they're constructed in 3. The hand that draws them is unsteady. It's drawn in an environment that's free from gravity and only loosely enables the exact plotting of points in space intentionally. As we zoom out, it's revealed that the drawing is of the exterior facade that the audience faces. From 1 glass block to 40, a window frame, the edges of a wall, and finally the perspective lines that construct a room. It's now clear that we're drawing the unprivileged view, the view of an interior that can't be seen due to the placement of the opaque projection screen. The world's an odd one, it's lonely, and despite the occasional glimpses and beeps, we're essentially spraying lines into space. The scene transitions to a camera located at the center of the room, setting up a 1-point perspective of the interior, looking towards the drawn window. The world changes from odd to semi-familiar. It's a static world compared to the one that we were just in, and the gaze is fixed. Its sense of stability flickers as objects begin to populate the room. The objects are both common, an exit sign, a couch, a desk, and uncommon as our own models, BairBalliet models, and a scale model of the night gallery, now an object itself, hijack the interior. Once fully populated, a slow zoom towards the window brings us into the third world. This world is the second to ignore gravity. Things float, and all things are equal. Our low-volume pool makes a grand entrance above, and Venice pavilions float amidst the chipboard model of the night gallery and other common office objects. Hierarchy between objects and the elements that construct the room are gone. As objects float across the screen, it's almost as if we're located between two worlds, trapped in the airlock between the initially constructed window and the real one. Movement stops momentarily, and the elevation of the night gallery confronts the camera head-on. The room evaporates, and the camera shifts to another privileged view, the axonometric. The night gallery volume tumbles, ounces liberated from the confines of its building mass. In the building elevation, it rejects an office chair and a vestige of a BairBalliet project, voicing its opinion on its design. The film ends on the night gallery facade, a conventional storefront overlaid with the thick drawn lines from the world of part one, simultaneously a flashback and flash forward, as we're now presented with the same view as those who are viewing from outside. The end.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Maybe we could continue talking about, let's say, both of your interest in the line, and maybe at this point, Catherine, we could maybe talk or maybe open it up as a way of speculating on the future of lines in architecture, which I think Kelly is kind of setting up here. Perhaps not, through maybe could be through the lens of the post-digital or even into the kind of virtual. So just if you have any thoughts on the presentation, and maybe we could have a few minutes discussion on that, and when we open up to the audience afterwards.
So that looks like an amazing project. And I would, I don't know specifically the question, I guess there are a couple things happening that I know about, and there's probably a lot happening that I don't know about. What I know about is that there is, big discussion right now about the post-orthogonal and how the orthographic histories of scanning and drawing and scanning and modeling and all the other sort of tactics that we use for in a system of representation. I understand that you're not in a system of representation to some degree, but that in traditional, more conventional systems of representation, that we use these these various methods for representing a whole variety of things. And so the post-orthographic is the virtual, is the signalization systems that are produced by computation, among other things, and so among other sort of devices. And so how we are using that technology and how we see it in relationship to the history of rendering, for example, a lot of people are looking at that right now. So from it's not meant to be a now and then argument, as in it used to be representation, and now it's now it's virtuality, or experiential or whatever. It's that it's immediate and it is, and it has no status other than it's being as is, or something. So that it's actually not meant to be that sort of dragging us back to something, or in some way resisting the future of virtuality or anything. It's much more about looking closely at like what is loaded into these different approaches to all the things you mentioned, right? In a way, space and so forth. So I would like to know how you would answer that question of what's the load that it carries, in a sense. You could say in the old terms, the old nomenclature. I mean, what a lot of these people are doing is they're trying to come up with a new nomenclature for, and I'm talking about some of the people like John May, or I guess Mario Carpo to a certain degree, or Peter Gallison and others, who are sort of reopening the question of objectivity and other ways, and sort of epistemic fields in relation to, and trying to use it to look at our virtual production. And so it'd be, and to figure out how, and they're not arguing that there's a pre-technical and a post-technical anything. They're sort of, we've always been technical as a species. And so it's, so I would like to hear how it's weighted, if it is, if there's some way in which aspects of it carry more weight than other aspects, in spite of the uniformity of the color, and also the storyline in a certain sense, or how you narrate the various players in the drama of it, or whatever. I don't know if that's a question that's meaningful at this moment, but that's yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that it was really great. I mean, I had read the kind of stories of or the recounting of Korb's donkey lines a long time ago, and so it was really great to kind of revisit that story, because through the lens of your text, because in some ways it seemed like the kind of exact pairing with this work, in the sense that that there's a part in Burdens of Linearity, in that chapter, where you're kind of questioning how non-straight is a line for Korb. Is it relatively straight? Is it like just off of 2 degrees? And I think for us, that kind of inquiry into how far off of straight or how far off of orthogonal, this work kind of opens up that possibility. And mostly, I think that comes from a place of the two of us are a pretty new practice. And the first project that we did together, which was the Venice project, really leaned on our kind of previous history, both of us Christy having taught in Vienna with Greg for a long time, and me having worked in Los Angeles with him, which was always about a kind of a precise line, or a precise spline. Like, you would never kind of donkey line. The most Greg would ever donkey line would be maybe in the Slavin house, and that's not a very donkey line. So, so I think that in Venice also was it was kind of the reason our practice even started up in the first place, and so we relied on the kind of things that we knew and had been kind of educated in, and I think that this work allows us to kind of still stick within a kind of more or less rigid geometric framework, but also kind of deviate, the 1 to 5 degrees from that. And so I think the other part of your question, you had a second part to.
Well, I mean, it was just more like, to kind of expand a little bit on the speculation. I mean, I'm not sure if for you, like, this type of project has already cleared the way out of representation and has become something else. Just to also kind of, follow up on that question.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the first project, the GLOW project, it's actually kind of a work in progress in a way, because the objects that were produced for the show have sort of defied representation. Like, it's never made sense to now go back and draw those things. And so maybe in a post-digital sense, we're looking at ways of imaging those things, or maybe placing them back in their original locations. So, you know, the plaque might end up in an Elks Lodge or something, to kind of further estrange them from the initial more like process-based stuff. And that project is maybe, it maybe never can get out of that representational phase, but I think some of the stuff that we're doing now is obviously trying to look at like scaling up some of the aesthetic fallout of that work in a way that's much more about the kind of tectonics of building, which is obviously a kind of typical trajectory in someone's work. And in some ways, I think our office is sort of an office in reverse, given that we, you know, our first project was a 26-acre, basically master plan in Detroit, and our most recent project is a 3-minute film or a, you know, 16-inch thing that sits on the wall.
Can I say?
Sure.
I didn't notice whether you, in that, whether the again, the players or the objects in your in that virtual space, whether they in any way cast a shadow, and whether you ever thought of having shadows, give them shadows, or have a shadow relationship, which immediately implies a sort of directionality to light and other things that we think of as rays, you know, in this interesting way. I asked that actually out of a very interesting paper by Lucia Allais at Princeton, who wrote about shadow casting as, in fact, a kind of throwback to the, that in looking throughout history, that whenever we want to make an image stand for the real, we use shadow casting. We use shadows to somehow situate it as to give it the dimension of the real. You know, to give it the character of the real, even though it's not real. And I mean, but the shadow actually comes from a radically different place. And so is there anything like the shadow in there that is coming from a radically different place? In other words, in order to enforce to not keep it in what I would call, and I'm really interested in how the diagrammatic has evolved as a container in a certain sense for the projective and the non-representational sort of conditions that we're thinking in more and more. And so I wonder if there are shadow-like sort of tactics that we're using in order to accomplish our argument with the virtual. I don't quite believe the idea that the image is without representational relationships. I can't cook them up at this moment for those images because I didn't have to study it more. But the virtual is deeply inscribed, virtual software and everything else is deeply inscribed in long-standing traditional orthogonal practices like perspectival representation, you know? So it's not like the virtual suddenly floated out of all of our devices are completely tied down by these paradigms of spatial organization. So I don't see how we think of ourselves as kind of floating above it or out of it. It's informing it at every turn, and it's not important whether it's representational or not, in my opinion. That's not so much its most compelling aspect, that it's released itself, unchained itself from, representation. Why do we, I mean, it maybe, I agree with a lot of what Gallison says about moving from representation to presentation, and it's pretty clear that what's happened in science in the latter part of the 20th century is really important, where we come into a whole different relationship, to space and time and biology, and so we clearly have to take account of that somehow. either in the midst of or beyond our paradigmatic tendencies, toward the sort of representational narrative and so forth. So I think that what the post-critical was doing at a certain moment, in invoking the diagrammatics of force, was incredibly important, and that translated into a lot of digital work by Greg Lynn and others that were looking to force to actually define to define in a certain sense the way we create, or the way we actually I don't know if it's create. I don't know what the next word is, but that the diagrammatics of force belonged more accurately to what is, not sort of what historically is bound, or whatever representational history we are burdened with. So I'm curious about the way in which we regard the virtual as some kind of release or freedom from something.
Right. Great. Well, I mean, I think because there is catering waiting for us upstairs, I mean, we spent some time taking questions from the audience, and it is a tradition here now at the school that we actually move the conversations to another place.
First, I want to say thank you to you, and to Bob, and to you.
No, thank you. We're still not done yet.
I know.
I mean, are there any questions? I mean, I think there has to be a lot of questions.
It struck me that what you said about the luck of being at Hopkins and the moment where post-structuralism was a kind of platform or lingua franca that would translate among disciplines with a high degree of speed and viral qualities, which I think is right, but it seems like what happens after 95 is that platform is replaced literally by technical platforms, which is to say software is then the new lingua franca that translates across disciplines, and no longer theory. Theory is sort of the handmaiden or the avant-garde of something that then develops a new technical regime that more quickly, virally, crosses boundaries and proprieties. And is that the world that we promoted but have come to inhabit, but somehow has gone on without us?
Yeah. It definitely has gone on without us. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it was longer than 5 years, but it definitely was short. It was a short, intense period, but it didn't really it wasn't a clean cut. The process studio went on for another 10 or 15 years. Greg Lynn's project, cooked up at Avery Hall, went on for quite a bit longer, and until it was overtaken in a sense. I mean, we were on that learning curve of the software, but it was overtaken in a certain sense by the ubiquitous computing at a certain moment, it wasn't a certain moment, it gradually overtaken, and the project was abandoned in a sense. The Greg and the others cooked up at Avery for trying to bring the process studio in a way into a sort of technical dimension, or technical context. So I think that's true, but I think the computer remains. The technical still needs interrogation, in my opinion. It's not we don't know what it is. I think it's very opaque what we mean when we say it's overtaken or it's everywhere, and it's clearly everywhere, but what is it? What is it? What kind of new tech, or what kind of evolved technicity is it? And the fact that it's being forwarded and deeply problematically, become a kind of a massive accumulation of data used to massively accumulate data that is then being stored in the anticipation of what? And so I think it's it can be said to be taking a sinister turn. I'm not necessarily pessimistic about it. It's also brilliant, in a lot of ways. So I can't just blanket over all the all the dilemmas and say, oh, they came to an end and we just started down our technical path, because we've actually, I think we've inscribed in the technical, the software carries it's front-loaded, you know, with certain certain ontological questions still, even if you've decided ontology is no longer a way to talk about this, that, you know, there are people designing the software according to certain, you know, it's very determined by, you know, actual projects and goals and plans for what it's going to do and what it's going to be. So it's not coming from nowhere. It's not coming from the extremely heavy cloud in any way. So I don't know. I mean, the amount of sheer material and management of it is just, that it's spawned, is just unbelievable. I mean, I was looking at those pictures of Amazon warehouse, I think, a couple of days ago, and it's staggering. And it's all like huge, like weird managerial system of just getting that stuff, you know, transferred from A to B. And so you say that the way in which it's infused our culture with just massive warehouses of data products that are all associated with the data that are now going to be passed around the world and everything. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So, and the, you know, the planes flying back and forth, just loaded with packages, you know, from these huge warehouses. I mean, it's just, so that end of the technical is often just kind of over here. That's why they call it the cloud, because they want it to float out of the picture. But in fact, it's extremely powerful in all sorts of ways. Yeah, I don't know. So the technical does require the same philosophical questions to some degree. Well, I mean, that new nomenclature, I don't know what it is exactly, but I don't think we get around it by claiming it as we don't get around it. We don't get a free pass in virtual space. We're still bound to these, you know, to these things that we, you know, are, you know, inscribed within. Just our human definition is the technical animal. So it's the tooled animal. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't really, you know, I'm not sure. I liked your comment. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is what you were saying, which was interesting. Like, you know, the idea of projecting or setting a trajectory goes wrong, paraphrase, almost immediately, which is like somehow gets messed up and you have to hack it.
Yeah.
And part of that is, you know, the legacy of the ideas that one puts into the world, or the projects that one puts into the world, go places that you're both surprised by and sometimes unhappy with. And part of it is like
Right.
what manifested itself as a fallout of something that you said, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Or, you know, like in other words, let's say Pratt today clearly would have an impact for multiple ways from your work. Do you find an affinity to it, or you mentioned object-oriented ontology or other ways in which things are going? I mean, do you have an out-of-body experience when you confront those things, or is it all sort of like, oh yeah, I see the, you know.
I like everybody. I'm completely, I don't know, some people may find it a legible way of going through that. I have no idea what's going on, really. I don't understand whether it's like good to have, you know, good to be known really well on the internet or something, or whether it's a really bad idea. It'd much more if you had no presence there whatsoever, and so on. I mean, I think it's really confusing right now. I don't think we know what we're doing. Actually, in some sense, we've entered this field of dreams that I think we're in a, I don't know what, do you understand? Do you feel like it's a system of knowledge or something we need in, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, I'm interested in scientific aspects of it incredibly, but yeah.
I think part of it is your description, which I think is interesting, a powerful one, like the instrumentality of groups. I think that's an interesting sociology, and the way it connects to some things Kel is doing and others in the school.
Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit too on the
You know, but,
fresh meat thing, yeah.
You know, I guess the question is, I guess for me, post-95 or post-98 or wherever you want to date it is preoccupied by forms of specialization that are contrary to the kinds of serendipity, surprise, chance, and amateurism that led to us in the field. And others like us.
Yeah.
And so, like, the sense that now, you know, in other words, would you have an affinity, even with the PhDs that enter the world who have been through sanctioned professional PhD programs,
Right.
as opposed to the arbitrary ways that you or Sanford or Jeff or Michael Speaks or myself or lots of other people entered the field without that form of proper professionalism and a kind of proper doctorate in the field. You know, and others, part of it was the fact that these were grenades from outside. And I'm just wondering, is that possible?
I thought of myself as like more rigorous and I was pursuing a rigorous, I've always feel like I've had that rigor that I would, I didn't feel arbitrary. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, you're right, that it was like, the amateurism persists, you could say. Amateurism is something we specialize in architecture. For some reason, we don't want to be rigorous about, I mean, the rigor, that's actually always has been an issue that comes up in relation to a lot of the post-structural work that people did, or the writing and the stuff, is people say, you know, it's incomprehensible. It's like, and the answer is, it's comprehensible in a context that you may or may not know, just like quantum physics is comprehensible in a context. If you don't know the context, it's incomprehensible. If you know the context, then you know what the issues are and what's at stake. So it's like what we do is we don't want to supplement the contextualization of those arguments we're bringing in a sort of loose manner from other fields, and that means that it appears arbitrary, but actually it's coming from, you know, that rigorous contextualization. And that's true of you, and it's true of everybody except maybe Jeff, who invented his own context every other minute. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean it in Barbara Johnson's definition of deconstruction of what it does is put surprise to work. Which I think is a good, you know.
That's interesting,
rigorous
yeah.
methods,
Yeah.
but the point of it is really
No, surprise is really important, yeah. Yeah.
But, you know, it seems to me that there's a fear of surprise today, which is aided and abetted by a bureaucracy of specialization and technocratic, you know, knowledge.
Yeah.
Which is an alibi, you know.
And also, yeah, I was interested, Also, it's hard for us now to have crises, even though we feel like we're getting crises all the time now. It's, that actually description, the concept of crises is unsustainable now in a way. Nothing is a crisis in a way, we just move on the next day, right? So that's why the typical political strategies of marching and complaining and protesting have like 1 day duration. They don't really move anything. And so there's a curious way in which we can't, you know, synthesize a crisis.
And
it's true in philosophical work as well. Yeah.
well, I hate to end on that note of content. I just been given the signal that we might want to move it upstairs, but I mean,
They're obligated to ask you a question.
sure. And so thank you, Catherine, again. Kelly, Bob, thank you for allowing us to talk.